Do they shake you up with all that talk about money?
Well, I'm not exactly used to it.
Same with me at first. Then I found out it's a charming habit around here. Susie. Sarah. I once read that names which begin with the letter S are the names of snakes.
Welcome to episode 16 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the terrors of ballet school, with two European horror films that are connected through more than just their depiction of dance. First up, we head to France and 2011 for Livid from the directing duo of Julien Maury and Alexandre Bustillo, starring Colloud, Marie-Claude Pietragalla, Marcq, and Felix Moati. Then we head over to Italy, or perhaps that should be Germany, and 1977 for Suspiria from director Dario Argento, starring Jessica Harper, Stefania Cassini, Alida Valli, and Joan Bennet. Both of this week's films can be said to be the horror movie as fairy tale, and if we are completely honest, neither is going to appeal to viewers who prefer naturalistic and realistic narratives. Livid moves the directors of 2007's French extremity movie Inside away from the extreme violence of their debut and into the realms of fantasy, while Suspiria is a full-blown assault on the senses that was inspired by Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, to name just one of its very diverse influences. Along the way, we'll be discussing the careers of Julien Maury and Alexandre Bustillo, Baroque approaches to lighting design, the creative and relationship dramas behind the scenes of Suspiria, fairy tale approaches to horror, and much, much more. And as you can tell from that little list, there's going to be quite a lot to get through today. And so instead of my usual, and some may say overly long, preamble on the key themes of the movies, this week we're going to jump straight in. Before we do that though, I would, as always, just like to mention the main sources that I've used as research for this week's episode. For Livid, I have used interviews with Julien Maury and Alexandre Bustillo on the websites Monstrous Industry, The New Horror Handbook, Medium, and cineeuropa.org. I've also referred to the book Films of the New French Extremity by Alexandre West. And for Suspiria, I have referred to the books Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds, The Dark Dreams of Dario Argento by Maitland McDonough, Fear, the autobiography of Dario Argento, The Man, the Myths and the Magic by Alan Jones, and Spaghetti Nightmares, edited by Luca Palmarini and Gaetano Mistretta. I've also referred to the documentaries Dario Argento, An Eye for Horror, directed by Leon Ferguson, and Dario Argento, Panico, directed by Simone Scafidi. And as always, all of my sources will be linked and listed in the show notes. Julien Maury and Alexandre Bustillo burst onto the horror scene in 2007 with their debut feature Inside, which, as we discussed last week, has been categorized as part of the so-called New French Extremity movement. Since then, the pair have directed 6 features together and a segment for an omnibus movie, with each venture exploring different subgenres from slasher to fantasy to urban weird and dark crime drama. And, as you can probably tell from that brief overview, their work is rather difficult to categorize. But while the two are keen to explore different aspects of the genre and are always working on a variety of scripts, more often than not, their choices are dictated by the somewhat random nature of finding the right producer and then what that producer is interested in financing. The two met through a mutual acquaintance. Julien was working in television and directing shorts and documentaries, while Alex was working as a film journalist for genre-focused publications, including Velvet and Mad Movies magazine. Maury, who was a long-time devotee of Mad Movies, which is essentially the French equivalent of Fangoria, admired Bustillo's writing, perspectives and taste, and a mutual acquaintance suggested that they work together, as Bustillo was already writing short scripts and Maury was already directing. The two met, realised that they had a lot in common, and, having no real connection to the French film industry, decided that they would, quote, do things like Peter Jackson or Sam Raimi, do it with our friends, shooting in the backyard or a forest. We already had the idea for Inside, and we were lucky enough to find a producer, and that's how it all started. End quote. Inside was released in 2007 and was an instant sensation, thanks to its extreme violence, amazing central performances from Alison Paradis and Beatrice Dahl, and the incredibly discomforting narrative of a pregnant woman as the victim of a home invasion. Bustillo already had the concept outlined when the two first met, and it was inspired by a friend's real pregnancy, with the writer saying that, quote, I asked myself what a pregnant woman alone home at night would feel. It certainly must be a very weird feeling. My first idea was to have a struggle between a pregnant woman and a serial killer who hunted her to eat her placenta, but it was too basic. Like every other slasher movie with a fucking bad guy on one side and a poor innocent girl on the other. Changing the gender of the bogeyman was more interesting, more original, and a real struggle for life. End quote. The timing could not have been more fortuitous, and according to Maury, it was indeed very much a case of being in the right place at the right time. The French TV channel Canal+ was hoping to capitalise on the sudden and undeniable popularity of the new French extremity movement, and agreed to finance the movie, leading to the casting of Alison Paradis and Beatrice Dahl, both of whom give pretty unforgettable performances. Mixing its theme of home invasion with the political context of the time, the movie also comments on the race riots that impacted Paris during the early 2000s, and depicts a society that has become desensitized to violence. Following its premiere at the 2007 Cannes Critic Week, the film gained a huge amount of attention, winning several awards at the Stitches Film Festival, and also illustrating the pair's eye for an arresting image. Maury has said from the beginning that the two wanted to create a very good-looking movie, and show the worst things imaginable in the best ways possible. Their direction to Laurent Barrez, their cinematographer, was to begin in a very realistic way, and then step by step, slip into more fantastic imagery, so that by the end the movie looks more like a dark fairy tale, with an emphasis on light and shadow. This is a technique that they would continue in several of their subsequent movies, and is inspired by the French Baroque painter Georges de la Tour, of whom Maury has said, quote, in terms of pictorial references, we have always been fascinated by de la Tour. His way to transcribe the darkness by using a single light source has always interested us, as filming the darkness is very difficult. End quote. This painterly technique, called chiaroscuro, and literally meaning light and dark, is one that uses strong contrast between light and shadow to create a very dramatic and visual effect. It was mastered by the artists Caravaggio, Rembrandt, and, as we've just mentioned, Georges de la Tour, who would often illuminate the figures in his paintings by a single source of light, like a candle or window. This then surrounds these subjects with a deep enveloping shadow, giving a sense of depth and highlighting the drama of the scene, or, in the case of horror, creating pools of absolute darkness to hide threat and heighten tension. This is, of course, a technique that we see in many movies, with directors using the effect to enhance mystery and mood, and we can certainly see examples of it in classic film noir, the works of Val Lewton, and the 1946 movie The Spiral Staircase. But Maury and Bustillo, in my opinion, really take it to the next level, with the interiors of Inside and Livid in particular taking on an incredibly painterly quality. The success of Inside brought the pair to the attention of Hollywood, and in October 2007, they were signed by Dimension Movies to write and direct the long-awaited reboot of the Hellraiser franchise, all of which was with the blessing of Clive Barker. Barker recounted in an interview with Mad Movie magazine that the two came to his house, and that after meeting them, any concerns he had about working on the remake evaporated. Sadly, though, this partnership was not to be. Dimension were reportedly very unhappy with the direction in which the two wanted to take the movie, and the directors were not happy with the studio's script rewrites. According to Maury, Dimension Films wanted a much more mainstream approach, including making the proposed heroine younger, as well as several other quote-unquote small, insidious changes. They left the project in 2008, and as we now know, it would take another 14 years for the reboot to finally reach the light of day. Personally, I think this was a lost opportunity, in more ways than one. I was not a fan of the remake, if I'm completely honest, and I think it would have been intriguing to see what the French duo would have come up with. But, as I said, it was just not to be. Having said that, the two remained on good terms with Dimension Films, leading to another opportunity in mid-2008 when they were in the frame to direct Halloween 2, the direct sequel to Rob Zombie's version of Halloween that had been released in 2007. However, by the end of the year, the project had changed, and Maury and Bustillo quietly departed, saying later that they had a different artistic vision from Dimension, so it's very much the same tale as with Hellraiser. As we all know, the movie would end up being directed once again by Rob Zombie, and the French directors have described this period as being a Hollywood learning curve, being courted for big horror franchises, but finding that studio demands were incompatible with their own style. And this is something that we also see happen in this week's film. Which, of course, brings us to our first film of the week, and this is Livid from 2011. Written and directed by Maury and Bustillo, it stars Chloe Colloud, Marie-Claude Pietragalla, Chloe Marcq, and Felix Moati. And before we go any further, I think it is worth explaining the title, which has a very different meaning in France than is more commonly used in English. In France, the meaning of livide or livid is not furious, but instead means pale, ashen, or bloodless, and it can also be used in a more figurative sense for somebody who is stunned or overwhelmed. Maury has said in the context of the movie they wanted to evoke an extremely pale, bloodless face, like that of a corpse, while also suggesting somebody in a state of fear, suggesting that all of those definitions appear somewhere in the finished movie. Originally, Livid was supposed to be an English-language production, shot in Ireland and the US, and starring Elijah Wood, with Robert Rodriguez also attached as producer. However, once again, creative differences got in the way, with the studio finding that the tone, and particularly the ending of the film, were too European, and became concerned that the average cinema-goer wouldn't understand the more poetic aspects. Wanting to keep creative control, the two decided to walk away from the deal and recamp to France, while adjusting the script to fit the now greatly reduced budget, going from $8 million down to €2 million, which was, in fact, a much smaller budget than even their debut feature. By all accounts, Elijah Wood, who, as we all know, is no slouch in the horror department, was still very keen on being in the movie. However, in the end, the filmmakers had to abandon the idea. They felt that they were essentially forcing an English-speaking character into a script that was essentially turning into a very French production, and so Elijah Wood left the project. And now we are getting into the spoiler section, so if you haven't seen the movie yet and are in the UK, as of the time of recording, you can find it on Apple TV and the Studio Canal Presents app and channel. We briefly discussed the new French extremity movement last week, and it's probably worth approaching this film with the understanding that it is often seen as the closing chapter of that period in cinematic history. Following the visceral violence of Inside, our writer-directors wanted to change register and reflect another aspect of the horror genre that they love, opting instead for a lyrical fairy tale with one foot in reality and the other firmly embedded in fable. And this is going to be somewhat frustrating for the uninitiated, who may be expecting something far more graphic and extreme and more in line with their debut feature. Certainly, this was a criticism that was mentioned at the time of the film's release, with people who were expecting savagery left rather baffled, if not disappointed, by the film's poetry and fantasy logic. And in accordance with fairy tale logic, there are many things in the movie that are not fully explained, if they are indeed ever explained at all. The vampires in the movie behave within the film's own mythology, which is very different from more commonly depicted beliefs. And the house itself in the movie also behaves according to its own rules, trapping people behind mirrors or existing in a whistling void of darkness whenever the sun sets. None of this is discussed or even explained to the viewer. It just is. Much like the Eastern European myth of Baba Yaga and her hut which walked around on chicken legs, this is just what the house in the film does, and the directors expect you to pretty much take it or leave it. According to Maury, the fairy tale aspect was very important to them both, and they wanted to give the audience the feeling that they were starting the journey from a realistic place and then slowly falling into a brand new world. Though both admitted that a total suspension of disbelief is necessary to accept the ending and its more phantasmagorical approach. And where you stand on this approach is really going to colour your enjoyment of the movie. If you are able to shrug to yourself and say, okay, the house slips into an alternate reality at night because it just does, then you'll probably get along with the film. And if not, you're also going to struggle with many of the elements of our second movie this week as well. In the 2023 documentary Dario Argento Panico, the director and writer Guillermo del Toro calls this the power to declare, the fairy tale belief that simply stating something makes it so. For del Toro, in fairy tales nobody questions why a princess lives at the top of a glass mountain, for example. It simply exists because the story says it does. And whilst he was very much talking about Suspiria in that interview, he may as well have been discussing Livid at the same time. The basic premise of the film leans into a horror trope that, strangely enough, seems to have become a staple over the past few years, and that is of the burglary gone wrong. We've already seen this in the 2016 movie Don't Breathe, as well as the film Villains from 2019, and lower-budget movies like Intruders from 2015 and The Owners from 2020. In the case of this week's film, the idea also came from a French novel called Malataverne by Bernard Clavel, which tells the story of a trio of youths who break into an old woman's house. Maury has expressed that he found reading the book incredibly frustrating because the moment that they enter the house is the end of the novel, and as a result the reader never knows what they find inside. This film then is the pair's continuation of that basic story and the imaginary scenario of what they do indeed find inside the house. The concept of myth and fable is introduced early, with references to the heterochromia of the central character Lucy. As we know from previous episodes, societal differences were often explained by superstition and folktale, and in this case, Lucy's two-coloured eyes are an indication that her body houses two souls, something that will become increasingly important as the story progresses. And just by the by, other myths around heterochromia are that it symbolises a connection to the other world, including the possession of psychic powers, and also indicates that the person has the ability to speak to spirits, as well as other magical creatures. This very early reference reinforces the notion that this will be a very different movie than Inside, essentially a fairy tale, with, admittedly, still very much an emphasis on the grim. The idea of the cursed ballerina is not just an excuse to play with the imagery of a blood-splattered tutu, something that we've seen relatively recently with the 2024 movie Abigail. In keeping with fairy tale logic, there is a tradition of bewitched or cursed dancers in folklore, and this would go on to influence cinema through the works of Michael Powell, Dario Argento, and then feeding into films like this, and even 2010's Black Swan. Two of the most well-known are The Tale of the 12 Dancing Princesses by the Brothers Grimm and The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen. In The 12 Dancing Princesses, 12 sisters are condemned to slip away from their castle every night into an enchanted underground world where they are forced to dance with 12 princes until dawn, only to return home every morning exhausted and with worn-out shoes. In Hans Christian Andersen's tale The Red Shoes, a poor girl, ironically enough called Karen, longs for beauty and status, and when she acquires a pair of red shoes, she cannot resist wearing them, even so far as to wearing them to church. However, as it turns out, these shoes become cursed, and once she puts them on her feet, she cannot stop dancing, until, in desperation, she begs somebody to cut them off. Even then, though, the red shoes dance on without her, dragging her severed feet in a horrific kind of river dance. This story, and the title, became the basis for the ballet performed in the movie The Red Shoes from 1948, and directors Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. This was a critically acclaimed and award-winning movie that is now widely recognized as one of the greatest films of all time, and certainly it is now impossible to make a ballet-based movie that doesn't exist somewhere in its shadow. The fairy tale of The Red Shoes has also gone on to inspire an album by the singer Kate Bush, a ballet by the choreographer Matthew Bourne, and a South Korean horror film from 2005. But back to Livid. It's not just fairy tales and myths that are referenced throughout the film, as there are several other nods to other horror properties, which seem to emphasize the artificiality and non-reality of the narrative. Lucy, William and Ben drink in a pub called the Slaughtered Lamb. Madame Jessel is named after the ghostly governess from the story The Turn of the Screw and its many, many film adaptations. The silver shamrock masks from Halloween 3 turn up, and most tellingly of all, inside the house, Lucy finds a certificate from a certain dance academy in Freiburg, Germany, inextricably linking the universe of this film with the world of Suspiria and Helena Marcos's Tanz Academy. Taking inspiration not just from Argento, but also the worlds of Guillermo del Toro and Hammer Studios, Maury and Bustillo aimed to create a film that depicted a realistic and credible universe in the first part, and then to dissolve into a fantasy world that felt on the edge of a dream for the second half of the film. Bustillo said that they wanted to, quote, make a macabre fairy tale, a strange legend that could be told at night by the fire, end quote. And while the original English-language version was to be shot in the States and Ireland, the duo decided to set the French version in Brittany, a land that shares a number of Celtic myths and beliefs with the originally proposed location. Principal photography began in late September 2010, with the production split essentially between two regions. The interiors were shot in and around Paris, and the exteriors were shot on location in Brittany. The filmmakers also managed to find an abandoned mansion just north of the capital, which would serve as the main interior for Deborah Jessel's house. And the house really is the centerpiece of the movie, a living entity that is filled with shifting rooms, endless corridors, and incredibly dark secrets. The pair wanted to create an interior location that was the antithesis of the location of their debut movie, creating something that essentially felt gigantic, wherein a person could easily get lost forever. The production designer, Mark Theobald, did an exemplary job in creating the world of the film, filling spaces with relics and curios that give clues to the history of the house and characters. Sadly, though, many of these sequences were cut in the edit, and this included a so-called Red Room sequence that homaged survival horror games such as Resident Evil. The two directors have said that without their editor, who goes by the single name of Baxter, their film would have been over 2 hours long, instead of the more audience-friendly 1 hour and 33 minutes of the final cut, that also tightened the suspense. Nevertheless, designer Theobald's work did not go unnoticed, and the movie won the award for Best Production Design at the Sitges Film Festival in 2011. As I mentioned earlier, the film's visuals have a very painterly quality, due to the use of the chiaroscuro techniques modelled on Delator, but they also took inspiration from another painter, Degas, particularly for the more naturalistic flashback scenes that were filmed in daylight, using his work as a reference for both lighting and for costume. The director of photography on Inside, Laurent Barthes, also returned for the movie, and it was, by all accounts, a very collaborative process, with the directors saying, quote, "We give him our references, our influences, and explain the feelings we want to convey, and after that he brings his vision and his ideas." End quote. Casting, though, was perhaps more of a challenging process, and while the lead character of Lucy would eventually be played by Chloe Colloud, she wasn't actually the first choice, with the original actress either leaving or being removed from the project, and forcing the directors to recast on extremely short notice. Colloud was essentially brought in pretty much overnight to fill the role of the central character, and had to dive into the admittedly intense shoot pretty much immediately. The role of Lucy's father also proved to have challenges, as the actor initially hired for the part sadly fell seriously ill during production, requiring the executive producer, Joel Charpentier, to step in and play the father character himself for the few brief moments that he is on screen. Beatrice Dahl returns from Inside for a small but important cameo as Lucy's mother, and she is joined by Catherine Jacob in the Renfield-esque role of Mrs. Wilson, and professional dancer Marie-Claude Pietragalla as Madame Jessel. Pietragalla also had to suffer for her art, developing an allergic reaction to the latex makeup, which required her body double to step in for certain sequences, most notably during the soul transference sequence, which, to my mind, also acts as somewhat of a homage to Silence of the Lambs. This ritual, of course, has been foreshadowed from the start of the movie, and the reference to heterochromia, suggesting that a special vessel is needed, in this case Lucy, for the exchange to work properly. The ending of the film is rather divisive, and if you haven't seen the movie, I am about to give it all away now. At the end of the movie, Lucy's soul is transferred into the body of the vampire Anna, and Anna's soul now inhabits Lucy's human body. As Anna Lucy watches, the vampire body, now containing Lucy's soul, is carried up by the sun, slowly disintegrating and presumably allowing Lucy to rejoin her mother in the afterlife, while Anna, now inhabiting Lucy's body, is free to live the life of a normal human, something that she has never been able to experience. In this sense, the movie is also about toxic relationships between mother and daughter, with Lucy permanently damaged by the suicide of her mother, and Anna literally and figuratively paralysed by her mother's domination. And these are themes that are also rather common in the doomed ballerina narratives of films like Black Swan and The Red Shoes. Livid premiered internationally on September the 11th, 2001 at the Toronto International Film Festival as part of the Midnight Madness lineup, and then a month later it played in competition at the Sitges Film Festival in Spain, where it won the Best Production Design Award that we mentioned earlier. Critically, the film met with a very mixed reception, with publications like Screen Daily comparing it favourably to the works of Guillermo del Toro and Dario Argento, whilst Variety suggested that, quote, "it was so eager to go over the top that in the end it doesn't make much sense," end quote. Sadly, though, many audiences wouldn't be given the opportunity to make up their own mind, as the distribution of the film on general release proved to be somewhat of a challenge. By all accounts, Livid barely saw the light of day in French cinemas, and played out on only a handful of screens. As a result, the box office numbers were incredibly disappointing, with only about 5,000 tickets sold during its run in France. Further distribution challenges would mean that it wouldn't be released in the US until March 2022, when it appeared on Shudder, an entire 11 years after its European release. Interestingly enough though, this did not stop the rumours of an English language remake doing the works, and one was reported to be in development as early as 2012, though nothing eventually came of it. Following Livid, Maury and Bustillo released the 2014 movie Among the Living, a rather bizarre coming-of-age horror that has been described as the Goonies meets the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In the same year, they contributed a segment for the anthology movie The ABCs of Death Part 2. Their contribution, X is for Xylophone, is pretty nasty stuff and is remembered as being one of the darker entries in the series. They followed this in 2017 with their first English language feature, Leatherface, a prequel to the Texas Chainsaw franchise. As we've already mentioned, the two had already been in the frame to direct Michael Myers and Pinhead, but they had also, in the interim, been lined up to direct the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, an idea which also fell through. So finally, in 2017, they got the opportunity to direct a different horror icon altogether. Sadly, the film was met with a very mixed reception, with some critics calling it the best film in the franchise since the original, and others questioning whether the story needed to be told at all, and saying it was either too gory or not gory enough. I watched the film for the first time the other night as preparation for this episode, and I would agree that it's probably not a story worth telling, though this admittedly may be more to do with my dislike of prequels in principle. That being said, it is certainly directed very well and it looks beautiful, leaning more into the director's European sensibilities than the imagery of the rest of the series, which again led to some criticism. After this, they returned to making films in France, with urban weird horror Candisha, released in 2020, and The Deep House, released in 2021, suddenly going viral after it was discovered and lauded by the TikTok generation 3 years after its initial release. More recently, the two adapted a novel called The Soul Eater into a movie of the same name, which was released in 2024 after premiering at the Fantasia Film Festival. This again pushed the pair into new territory, expanding their repertoire into the crime drama, though the film certainly still has more than its fair share of horrific scenes. It's currently available on Shudder, and I quite enjoyed it, I have to say, though given it's an incredibly bleak film, I'm not sure that enjoyed is the right word. Although it is of course a French movie, I would recommend it if you have ever been a fan of Nordic noir TV shows, like The Bridge or the original Swedish version of the detective series Wallander. And if you've never seen those series, I would highly recommend adding them to your watch list at the earliest opportunity. In any case, The Sin Eater shares much more DNA with those types of dramas than it does with Insight or even Livid, though there are also some incredibly violent moments, showing that there is still a little of the DNA of extreme cinema hiding there somewhere. With a variety of films ranging from urban weird to home invasion to French extremity and legacy sequels, Julien Maury and Alexandre Bustillo are certainly not cemented to one style of horror or another, so it's hard to predict what they might be releasing next. One thing, though, that is absolutely for certain is that whatever it is, it will be released very much on their own terms and no one else's. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is, of course, Suspiria from 1977. Directed by Dario Argento from a screenplay by Dario Argento and Daria Nicolodi, it stars Jessica Harper, Stefania Cassini, Alida Valli, and Joan Bennet. Suspiria is probably the most famous of Dario Argento's movies, and is the answer that I most commonly give when someone asks me to name my favourite horror film. To be fair, I think it's actually rather a disingenuous answer, as the real one is very much it depends on what mood I'm in at the time, but this film certainly ranks in my top 10. And as with many films that I experienced in my late teens, I actually read about this one before I saw it, firstly from Stephen King in his book Danse Macabre, where he positions it in the context of movie gross-out moments, saying, quote, "In Dario Argento's Suspiria, a bunch of schoolgirls are subjected to a rain of maggots, all while sitting at the dinner table, no less. All of it has nothing to do with the film's plot, but it is vaguely interesting, in a repulsive sort of way." End quote. all of which in hindsight seems rather dismissive, not to say inaccurate, but it certainly piqued my interest. I finally saw the movie on VHS a few years later and was immediately transported by the over-the-top soundtrack, Technicolor cinematography, and moments of extreme violence. Most notably, of course, the opening murder sequence. I still believe that Suspiria holds one of the greatest openings to a horror movie ever filmed, and once had a flatmate get very annoyed with me after that first killing, storming from the room and fully blaming me for any nightmares that may incur as a result. So, I rest my case. But before we go any further, it is probably appropriate to address the witch-shaped elephant in the room and discuss whether or not this film can be classified as a giallo movie. This is a debate that still very much continues online, and it's impossible really to not talk about the film without saying where you stand. So, although this, quite frankly, is not a hill that I am particularly passionate about dying on, from my perspective, this film is not a giallo. There, I've said it. I would personally categorise it as a supernatural horror film, though one that does admittedly use many giallo tropes. These include the protagonist travelling to a strange country and accidentally noticing something that makes no sense until the denouement, when it is then revealed to be a vital clue. There are, of course, also the elaborate and over-the-top murder set pieces. However, the basic rules of the giallo, by the very people that created the subgenre, say that all explanations have to be grounded in logic, and as a film about magic and witches, Suspiria moves far more into the realms of the supernatural than it does the real. In recent years, people have tried to argue otherwise and said that Suspiria is in fact a supernatural giallo, and in their arguments they mainly cite these similar tropes. However, given that Argento popularised and amplified many of the tropes himself, it is perhaps hardly surprising to find them present in his work. That being said, Argento himself has said that he sees very little difference between his more fantastical films and his gialli, saying that his quote-unquote realistic pictures aren't that realistic either, even though they are more about psychopaths than they are witches. To be fair, this is probably all a bit rich coming from me, where I'm playing fast and loose with the definition of the word horror each week just for this podcast. And I'm sure that I won't be able to convince anyone on the other side of the argument to change their point of view. But it is my opinion that the film is not a giallo, and that's the one I'm going to be sticking with. And sticking with controversy for just a little longer, it is now also probably the right moment to address the two conflicting stories about the creation of the movie and the extent of creative contribution from Argento's then partner, the actress Daria Nicolodi, with whom he also had a daughter, Asia. In his autobiography, Fear, Dario Argento suggests that Suspiria was very much initially conceived by him and was inspired by the Walt Disney movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, though he does say that Dario helped enormously with research and screenwriting. However, according to Nicolodi and many of the Argento biographies, the original concept was based very much on her family experiences, most notably the experiences of her own grandmother, who had been sent away to a finishing school where witchcraft and magic had been practiced after hours. Nicolodi recounted this tale to Argento when they were making the movie Deep Red in 1975, and it was this story that inspired the basis of Suspiria. In an interview for the book Spaghetti Nightmares, Nicolodi had the following to say, quote, "The treatment of Suspiria derives in part from the stories that my grandmother used to tell me, and in part from reading a book called Confessions of an English Opium Eater, written by Thomas de Quincey. Dario only had a superficial knowledge of de Quincey's literature, but I was reading it intently, and so I suggested it to him." End quote. The real problem seemed to come over the casting of the role of Susie, which would eventually go on to be played by Jessica Harper. Nicolodi always contested that the part was written by her and for her, and that it was pressure from the studios that resulted in Argento offering the role to the American actress. At this point, according to Nicolodi, she was offered the supporting role of Sarah, but decided to quit the production, with an official story circulating that an ankle injury had caused her to withdraw. Argento's story is somewhat different, saying that the issue was that he had just been unclear and had erroneously led her to think that the lead role could have been hers. This, perhaps unsurprisingly, led to the breakdown of their relationship, and Daria left, taking their daughter Asia with her. In the documentary Dario Argento Panico, Asia herself describes Suspiria as something of an elephant in the room, with her parents each telling their very different stories of its origin. She does, however, point out that while her father never seemed particularly interested in the magical arts, her mother owned several shelves of books on the subject, and in her view, Suspiria has always been her mother's story. She would also go on to say that her mother often spoke about how she had been meant to play the role of Susie Bannion, and that disappointment lingered as a deep resentment until the end of her life. Daria herself would go on to say that everything belonged to her in Suspiria, and there was a lengthy battle for her contribution to be recognised. Even a few days before the premiere, she reported that she was uncertain whether her name would actually appear in the credits, though I'm happy to say that it does. So the origin story is indeed a little murky, to be fair, but what we definitely do know is that the film is partly inspired by the writer Thomas de Quincey and his essay, Nirvana and Our Lady of Sorrows. Thomas de Quincey was an English writer who is best remembered for his memoir Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which was published in 1821. He was born in 1785 in Manchester, England, to a wealthy family, but his father's death and his mother's very strict religious beliefs did not necessarily combine to make for the happiest of childhoods. He dropped out of Oxford University and lived in poverty in London, which is when he first encountered laudanum, a preparation of opium that is dissolved in alcohol. This was initially taken as a pain relief, but it soon became addictive, not least for the opioid visions that it also granted. Given its highly addictive nature, it is no surprise that laudanum and opium marked both de Quincey's life and his art. His great success came when Confessions was serialised in London Magazine, and Victorian readers were equal parts horrified and fascinated. De Quincey became, somewhat unwillingly, the founding father of modern drug literature. In 1845, he published a work called Suspiria de Profundis, or Sighs from the Depths, which housed an essay entitled Livana and Our Ladies of Sorrow. This was a visionary prose piece where human grief is personified as a trio of terrifying sisters. These sisters are Mater Lacrimarum, the mother of tears, who embodies mourning, Mater Suspiriorum, the mother of sighs, who brings anxiety and despair, and Mater Tenebrarum, the mother of darkness, who brings ruin, madness, and annihilation. This piece of writing became the basis for what we now know as Argento's Three Mothers trilogy, with each entry telling the story of one of the three sisters. Suspiria, as its name suggests, tells the story of the Mother of Sighs. Though, to be fair, we do not learn any of the mythology until the second movie in the series, so it could just as well stand alone. And here we are getting into the spoiler section of the episode, so again, please do proceed with caution if you haven't yet seen the film. Much like Livid, Suspiria is very much a filmic fairy tale and works under the principle of the power to declare that we mentioned earlier. And as a fairy tale, it begins with a voiceover that might as well start with Once Upon a Time. Quote, Susie Bannion decided to perfect her ballet studies in the most famous school of dance in Europe. She chose the celebrated Academy of Freiburg. One day, at 9 a.m, she left Kennedy Airport, New York, and arrived in Germany at 10:40 p.m. local time. End quote. On arriving at the school, Susie encounters a frightened young girl running from the building, who mumbles a few words in the middle of a rainstorm. This girl is Pat Hingle, who is brutally murdered in the film's memorable opening set piece, and the partially overheard conversation forms part of the film's central mystery. As Susie eventually settles into the school, she learns that it was once the home of a notorious witch, and as the film progresses, we learn that witchcraft is still very much being practiced by the staff. To maintain the fairy tale concept, initially Argento's plan was to have very young girls in the leading roles, aged between 11 and 14 years old. However, the distributor and Argento's father, the producer Salvatore Argento, fought against this, saying quite rightly that nobody really wanted to see 12 and 13-year-old girls brutally murdered in a horror film. Argento then raised the ages of the children in the story, but decided to keep some elements from the original concept, saying in his autobiography, quote, "I was forced to raise the ages of the young ballerinas to around 18 to 21 years old, though I still kept elements in the scenery and the script to give the suggestion that the characters were much younger. I asked the actresses to act like children, to bicker and make mischief, even when they weren't in front of the lens. To this end, I also wrote some lines using deliberately childish language. Eventually, I managed to find a way to distort the public's perception. For the scenes that took place in the dance academy, I had the doors made bigger than the standard, with handles placed much higher than normal. In this way, the perspective could have been that of a child." End quote. This then certainly accounts for some of the dialogue in the movie, not least the exchanges in the girls' locker room about names that begin with the letter S. It also, of course, accounts for the somewhat disorientating perspectives, something that the director was keen to build on through the way that the film would be shot. Regardless of your view on the origin story of the movie, it cannot be denied that the influence of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is very much present, certainly in terms of how the film looks. Argento says that he wanted to achieve the same colours as the Disney cartoon, which he described as a saturated technicolor with which he had been somewhat obsessed since seeing the film as a child. This led to he and cinematographer Luciano Tavoli opting to film in an all but obsolete technicolor system, allowing them to push certain colours during the print process, and creating a film in which the dominant shades are blue, red, green, and gold. According to some, Suspiria is the last film in cinema history to be made using that system, and in Argento's biography, he goes on to explain that the equipment they used was then sold to a Chinese company who donated it all to a museum. He also recalls that the entire process was incredibly expensive, with his father questioning his sanity as the bills came rolling in. All of that, of course, soon changed once he saw the final product, though he did admonish his son further to not attempt anything like it again, for fear that they would end up penniless. The result of this is a film that looks really unlike any other, with the intensity of the colours creating a dreamlike and hallucinatory experience, combining with the deafening score to create an overwhelming assault on the senses. The director Nicholas Winding Refn, who homages Suspiria extensively in his 2016 movie The Neon Demon, has called his initial reaction to it an emotional and physical indoctrination, and one can quite easily see why, particularly in the overwhelming first section. Argento has described this as wanting to open the movie like a volcano, something that would push both he and the audience to the very limits, saying that he wanted to make the public scream, "Enough, I can't take it anymore." The sequence actually took 3 months to film, and he describes the opening as being a succession of explosions, lightning, screams, broken glass, stabs to the heart, and a hanging, and all before the film has been running for 15 minutes. Edgar Wright, who would also go on to homage Argento in both Baby Driver in 2017 and Last Night in Soho in 2021, has called this opening one of the greatest set pieces in horror cinema, highlighting that whilst most horror films start with a sense of normality, in Suspiria you are immediately brought into a world of expressionistic technicolor. In addition, John Carpenter has pointed to the opening sequence as being the perfect example of inexplicable dread, and arguing that it is this feeling of inexplicable dread that makes the film so extraordinary. By the time that Pat Hingle gets her head pulled through a window, we have been wound up to a point of expectation so intense that her murder comes almost as something of a relief. As I mentioned earlier, it is, in my opinion, one of the most striking openings to a horror movie ever made, and you can just ask my former flatmate. And it probably comes as no surprise to know that this scene was originally cut by the censors, with several frames removed from prints altogether, only to be restored again several years later. Much of this feeling of inexplicable dread comes courtesy of the soundtrack from the band Goblin, who had already scored Argento's 1975 giallo Deep Red. And, as with that film, Argento wasn't just looking for a simple, straightforward soundtrack. He wanted the score to become a fundamental presence in the movie. In his words, he wanted the score to become a character in its own right. Prior to production, during a holiday in Greece, he had overheard some traditional music performed on a bouzouki, and immediately understood that this was part of the sound that he wanted for the film. He recorded the local musicians, and even went so far as to buy himself a bouzouki, before sitting down with Goblin, who would then go on to create the soundtrack. Claudio Simonetti of the band explained that the score for Suspiria was indeed built around the bouzouki, but also the Indian tabla and, most strikingly, a massive Moog synthesizer. He later reflected that with Suspiria, they had effectively created a new genre of music, and whilst it couldn't be called inimitable, as many other musicians went on to imitate it, he believed that the true essence of Goblin's sound was never clearer than in the soundtrack they created for this film. And it is, without question, a stunning piece of work, and one that has to be heard to be believed. And what's perhaps even more interesting was the fact that the film score was written before shooting had even begun, with the director blasting it across sound stages during filming to get the cast in the right frame of mind. As we discussed a few weeks ago, the score was also influential on the director John Carpenter, who was impressed by its absolute simplicity, arguing that a more conventional soundtrack would have made the film a much less frightening experience. He's also, of course, gone on to say that he took some inspiration from the simplicity of the Suspiria score when he was writing the score for Halloween in 1978. Jessica Harper, who had turned down a role in a Woody Allen movie to take the lead role in Suspiria, has recalled that during filming she recognised that what they were working on was beautiful and unusual, though she admits she didn't realise just how groundbreaking it would prove to be. She gives a suitably wide-eyed and innocent performance, and one can see the influence of Disney's Snow White in both her casting and the look and costumes that she is given in the movie, though it is somewhat distracting to see her smoking what appears to be an enormous joint towards the last quarter of the film. She is joined by the actress Stefania Cassini in the role of Sarah, who said of the film, quote, "It's a great pop opera. We needn't have spoken in the film, we could have sung. It was all so closely tied up to the suggestiveness of the images and the colours, and there was this unusual score, this great Baroque setting, the girls' boarding school, the whispering, the chattering, the noises. It was all a great opera." End quote. Cassini, by all accounts, had a good experience on set, though both she and Harper do not have fond memories of the aforementioned maggot sequence, with Harper revealing that shooting for 11 hours with maggots in your hair did make her feel somewhat inured to the horror of the finished product when she finally saw it. For Cassini, even worse was to come, as she was not advised that she would be falling into a room full of coiled wire during her now lengthy and infamous escape sequence. Wanting to capture her genuine reaction, Argento only told the actress that she would be leaping into space and succumbing to an evil force. In reality, she quite literally fell into a coil of wire, and her panicked reaction that we see on the screen was, according to the director, partly real. Whether this method approach was actually necessary, I will leave very much down to you, but you may be relieved to know that they only did one take, and this was the one that was used in the final product, mainly because Argento says he didn't want to put the actress through a similar torture again. Fortunately, the older members of the cast were spared such indignities, which is probably just as well, given their status in Hollywood history. For the part of Madame Blanc, Argento wanted a famous star from the past, a face that would evoke memories of the golden age of Hollywood cinema. Initially, they considered Jane Russell, who had appeared in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes opposite Marilyn Monroe, as well as numerous other cinema classics. But she had abandoned cinema, and they were forced to take a different approach. It was only after a call from a casting agent that Argento was advised that one possible candidate would be Joan Bennet. Born in 1910 in Fort Lee, New Jersey, Joan Bennet was the youngest of three performing sisters, with Constance and Barbara Bennet making up the trio. She initially appeared as a blonde ingenue, but really came to public attention after she dyed her hair brunette, leading to a darker and more sophisticated screen persona. In the 1940s, she would become incredibly well known for her work in film noir, most notably several movies for director Fritz Lang. These included the film Manhunt in 1941, The Woman in the Window in 1944, and Scarlet Street in 1945. However, in 1951, her screen career was impacted by a scandal after her then-husband, the film producer Walter Wagner, shot and injured a man called Jennings Lang, who was Bennet's agent. Wagner did so on the suspicion that Bennet and Lang were having an affair, and this was a charge that she adamantly denied. However, the damage to her reputation was significant, as Hollywood sought to distance itself from the scandal. Bennet continued a career on the stage, and later she said of the scandal, quote, "It would never happen that way today. If it happened today, I'd be a sensation. I'd be wanted by all the studios for all pictures." After the scandal, she also continued to work in television, and most notably received star billing in the daily gothic soap opera Dark Shadows, which ran on television in the after-school slot between 1966 and 1971. For a series that crossed multiple realities as well as time loops, it is unsurprising that she ended up playing multiple parts, and was also nominated for an Emmy Award in 1968. Argento was a huge admirer of Fritz Lang, and this is what initially attracted him to casting her. It has been widely reported that she maintained a rather distant presence on set, but Jessica Harper has recalled that Bennet advised her to never let the cameras see her smoking, giving her the benefit of Bennet's Hollywood studio system education. Suspiria would mark her final film role, and one for which she would receive a 1978 Saturn Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. Celebrated for having a very dry and self-deprecating sense of humour, she once said in an interview, quote, "I don't think much of most of the films that I made, but being a movie star was something I liked very much." End quote. She passed away at her home in Scarsdale, New York, leaving behind a legacy of over 70 features, from silent movies of the 1920s to 1940s film noir and 1970s Euro horror. Several of her Fritz Lang movies are available to watch for free on YouTube, including The Woman in the Window, in which she stars opposite Edward G. Robinson. And if you are a fan of film noir, then I highly recommend giving it a watch. Joining Bennet is another figure of some repute, the actress Alida Valli, who made her name as an ingenue in 1930s Italian cinema, most notably under the Telefoni Bianchi filmmaking style that we discussed a few weeks ago. By the time that war broke out, her career was put on pause, and she was actually suspended from acting for refusing to appear in fascist propaganda films. Following the war, she returned to the screen with a darker and more complex presence, and was quote-unquote discovered by producer David O. Selznick, who took her to Hollywood in the late 1940s and introduced her simply with the surname of Valli. All of this feels very much like an attempt to create another Greta Garbo, but this did lead to her being cast in perhaps one of her most defining roles, and this is opposite Orson Welles in the 1949 movie The Third Man. She continued to work in international pictures for directors including Visconti, Bertolucci, and Antonioni, and horror fans will recognise her not only from her role in Suspiria and its sequel Inferno, but also from her performance in Georges Franju's Eyes Without a Face from 1960. While the plan to make her the next Garbo didn't exactly come to fruition, She carved out an incredibly varied body of work, from the glossy melodramas of the Telefoni Bianchi to Baroque horror and beyond. On her death in 2006, she had appeared in more than 100 films in a career spanning 7 decades, and her presence in this film, alongside that of Joan Bennet, harks back to the golden ages of Hollywood and European cinema, adding to the levels of artificiality that we see in the film. Jessica Harper has also pointed out that, very unusually for a film of this time, Suspiria is a movie that is dominated by women, saying, quote, "Suspiria was a groundbreaking film in another area, and it's something that Dario is never given the credit for. It was completely dominated by women. In his later work, he has also given his best material to women. That was very unusual at the time. It was rather nice working with a mainly female ensemble for a change." End quote. Principal photography took place largely between February and May 1977, with the filming mainly based at the De Paolis studios in Rome, where the elaborate sets had been constructed, though there was some additional location shooting in Freiburg, Munich and Bavaria. The square in which Daniel, the blind piano player, is killed was filmed at the Königsplatz in Munich, a site where Hitler had often held rallies, and which Argento chose specifically for this reason, subliminally suggesting the horrors that lurk beneath the surface of the story. It was, by all accounts, a very supportive set, and several of the actors have commented on the collaborative approach that Argento took with them. Jessica Harper would later say to writer Alan Jones, quote, "He was wonderful to all the actors. He knew how to take care of his leading ladies and how to deal with them. I was a bit concerned that Joan Bennet might be hard to handle because she came from that very strong 1940s American tradition of the studio star. But she wasn't arrogant or self-involved at all. She was a lovely, lovely woman, and I admired her a great deal." End quote. Stefania Cassini, who plays Sarah, also had very positive memories of the experience, becoming friends with both Harper and Alida Valli, of whom she said, quote, "She shows great sensitivity towards young actresses and possesses a measure of humanity seldom found in stars of her caliber. She's the exact opposite of the character she plays in the film." End quote. To be honest, it is rather difficult to comment on the acting, as the performances all need to be somewhat overblown to avoid being overshadowed by the bombast surrounding the actors. And I would also argue that if you are going to an Argento movie for naturalism, you're really looking in the wrong place. On the film's release in 1977, the Monthly Film Bulletin wrote that Argento's directing style essentially precluded the possibility of real acting, but noted that the cast coped bravely, with Alida Valli lending exactly the right sort of overblown presence that was needed. Of course, the film is also dubbed to varying degrees of success, and this again makes it hard to be objective about the performances. If we are to take the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs / fairy tale analogy to its natural conclusion, then the performances and characterizations are suitably pitched, though it might be argued that beside Bennet and Valli's suitably over-the-top performances and Cassini's terrified fragility, Susie comes across as somewhat of a bland heroine, late-night joints notwithstanding. Gene Siskel, writing in the Chicago Tribune, thought that Harper was underused, or at very least underwritten, but then he didn't like the movie all that much to begin with. Interestingly though, he did pick up on the fact that Harper had been quote-unquote costumed to look much younger than her years, something that he perhaps didn't necessarily sense was deliberate. Personally, I've always found the villains of fairy stories more interesting than the protagonist, but as a final goal, it must be said that Susie is among one of the better ones, searching the school for secret passageways and doing away with the Mother of Sighs single-handed before fleeing the building as it bursts into flames. On its release in 1977, Suspiria received a very mixed reception from the critics, while enjoying a strong and career-defining reception outside of Italy, most notably in the US. For those who have seen the film, which I hope by now is the majority of people listening, it is not surprising to find out that it was, on its release, incredibly divisive, and the arguments that are made about the film today are really no different than the arguments that were made when it was first released. While some criticise the movie as a triumph of style over substance, with a complete disregard for narrative logic and plausibility, others celebrated its unique style, soundtrack, and groundbreaking cinematography, with one critic calling it, in an incredibly backhanded compliment, quote, a movie that makes sense only to the eye, end quote. Even today, the film is very much one that people either love or loathe, celebrating its successes or criticising the somewhat thin nature of its plot and characterizations, which feels a little bit like criticising the motivations of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The characters in Suspiria behave in the way that they do because they are literally characters in a fairy story, and Goldilocks behaves in the way that she did because she's a greedy and entitled spoiled little brat. And in my opinion, an effective horror film doesn't always need to go much further than that, as long as it can give you something else in return. It goes without saying, of course, that Suspiria is now a cult classic, if not a phenomena, and is continually discovered and rediscovered by new generations, some of whom dismiss it as a gaudy Technicolor confection, and others who are completely seduced by its overwhelming style and theatricality. Much like the theatre of the Grand Guignol that we discussed in last week's episode, Suspiria is not interested in painting a realistic world. It is instead a fusion of Walt Disney fairy tale and opium-induced nightmare, and its sole purpose is to dazzle and to shock. Its style has been emulated by directors including Darren Aronofsky in Black Swan, Edgar Wright in Last Night in Soho and also in Baby Driver, and Nicholas Winding Refn in his movie The Neon Demon, though I would also argue that you can see Argento's influence in his 2013 movie Only God Forgives. As many will know, Suspiria was of course remade in 2018, starring Tilda Swinton, Dakota Johnson and Mia Goth. I have to say I didn't particularly like it, though I did admire their attempt to take the story in a different direction rather than just producing a carbon copy. But to be fair, I think it's probably best for all parties if I just drop the subject there. Argento would go on to direct the second in the Three Mothers trilogy in 1980 with the movie Inferno, which some would argue is his masterpiece, particularly those who feel that Suspiria is perhaps too much of a three-ring circus. Whilst I can see their point, little bit, the sheer theatrics and batshit insanity of Suspiria just give it the edge, in my opinion. I've yet to see another film quite like it, although I have seen several that have attempted to copy it, and failed rather miserably, and I think that probably says it all. Suspiria and Livid are both movies that emerge from the shadow of the Red Shoes to depict the world of ballet as a world of the uncanny, with the ballet school a prison in the first movie and a coven in the second. But whilst the certificate in Madame Jessel's house places the movies in the same universe, stylistically they are in fact a universe apart. Livid takes a slow and melancholic approach, using fairy tales, myth and folklore to frame a story that, at its heart, is about the damaging relationships that can form between mother and daughter. Suspiria is a far more kinetic and wild movie, which overwhelms the senses with its expressionistic use of colour, stylized violence and relentless score. Though one might argue that with its ancient mother of sighs lurking in the basement, it is as much about the terrible mother archetype as it is about anything else. Both, of course, are also examples of the horror movie as fairy story, requiring a fair amount of suspension of disbelief, and as a result, both films are rather divisive. If you really need a logical answer as to why a dance school would have a literal room full of piano wire, I understand why the response, because it just does, can be a little frustrating, and these probably aren't the movies for you. But if you are able to suspend disbelief, and have faith in Del Toro's idea of the power to declare, there is a great deal to enjoy in both films, not least their ability to turn tales of childhood into stories of absolute terror. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and so it just leaves me now to say thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you are enjoying the show. If you are, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please also consider sharing this episode, or indeed any episodes of the show so far, with any of your horror-loving friends. If you have any thoughts on any of the films we've discussed so far in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Instagram at thehorrordouble. And just before I get into next week's films, I want to mention a movie that was a real highlight for me at Fright Fest this year, and one that is worth keeping an eye out for. This is a film called Redux Redux, which was written and directed by the McManus brothers, who created the very interesting movie The Block Island Sound a few years ago. Redux Redux was the absolute highlight of the film festival for me this year, and I believe it's going to be released at the start of 2026. So keep an eye out for it, because it is excellent. And now that we are heading into cooler weather, and indeed the British autumn, next week we're going to be exploring two movies that use the changing of the seasons and the decaying countryside as visual metaphors for the increasingly fractured psyches of their central characters. First up, we have Let's Scare Jessica to Death from 1971 and director John Hancock, starring Zora Lampert, Barton Heyman, Kevin O'Connor, and Marie-Claude Costello. Then we are following this with Symptoms from 1974, a British-made movie from director Jose Ramon Larraz, starring Angela Pleasance, Lorna Heilbronn, and Peter Vaughan. And if you want to watch along and are in the UK, you can currently see Let's Scare Jessica to Death on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, Google Play Movies, and YouTube. And you can find Symptoms on Apple TV, Amazon Prime Video, and also the BFI player. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you so much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.